A new world is about to be born from your choices. But before that, subscribe to the channel to support new stories and follow each chapter of this journey. Shall we continue? The smile appeared even before the screen loaded. It wasn't a wide smile, the kind that demands witnesses, but the discreet gesture of someone who feels in control. The investor rested his elbow on the glass desk in his office, pushed his swivel chair back a few centimeters, and ran his finger across the trackpad with the naturalness of someone who has repeated this ritual for years. "I just want to see my balance," he thought, as if it were an irrelevant detail in the middle of an ordinary morning. The office occupied the 12th floor of a modern building in Chicago's financial district. Large windows let the city in without asking permission. The movement of cars below, the metallic reflection of neighboring buildings, the light grey sky typical of a leisurely Tuesday. Everything in that environment reinforced the feeling of stability. Expensive furniture, controlled silence, air conditioning at the exact temperature. It was the kind of place where nothing unexpected should happen. He had built that routine with almost obsessive discipline. Waking up early, strong coffee, a quick read of the economic news, a few orders adjusted before the market opened. He wasn't an impulsive gambler. On the contrary, he prided himself on being methodical, calculating, immune to collective panics. While colleagues lost sleep during crises, he slept peacefully, convinced that he had anticipated all relevant risks. That morning, nothing indicated otherwise. The markets had opened stable, without major fluctuations. No urgent news flashed on his cell phone alerts, no alarming emails from the brokerage firm, just another routine access to the investment platform, another silent confirmation that everything was going as expected. The system took a few extra seconds to load. He frowned slightly but wasn't bothered. Connections fail, servers overload. Experience had taught him that small delays meant nothing. He used the time to adjust his tie and take a sip of his already lukewarm coffee. When the numbers finally appeared, something didn't immediately fit. There was no instant shock, no explosive reaction. His brain tried, reflexively, to reorganize the information as if it were looking at an inverted graph or a column out of order. His eyes scanned the screen from top to bottom, searching for the familiar pattern, the total balance, the distributed assets, the accumulated return line. The pattern wasn't there. The displayed value seemed incomplete, smaller than it should be, much smaller. He leaned forward, bringing his face closer to the monitor, as if the distance were the cause of the error. He blinked a few times, took a deep breath, and refreshed the page. The smile had already disappeared, replaced by a neutral, tense, almost clinical expression. The refresh confirmed what he didn't want to admit. The number remained there, motionless, indifferent to his disbelief. It wasn't a small daily variation, nor a one-off drop in a specific asset. It was an absence, a gap too large to be ignored, too large to be explained by common volatility. He opened another tab, accessed detailed reports, filtered by date, by investment type, by brokerage. Each click increased the silence in the office. No alarm sounded. No automated message explained what was happening. Just cold, organized data showing that a significant portion of what he believed he possessed was simply no longer there. On the other side of that screen was someone or something responsible for those transactions. He didn't yet know who or how, but the feeling began to creep in uncomfortably. This wasn't a simple mistake. It wasn't an obvious bug. The movement seemed too clean, spread over days, perhaps weeks, cleverly diluted so as not to attract immediate attention. Meanwhile, the world continued as normal outside. Phones rang in other offices. People laughed in distant corridors. The market continued to operate, indifferent to the fissure opening up inside. The investor clenched his fists unconsciously, feeling the slight pressure of his fingernails against his palm. He had always believed that the real danger came from impulsive decisions, irrational markets, unexpected global crises. He had never seriously considered the possibility that the threat could grow silently, hidden within the very structure he trusted. Something had moved without him noticing, and now, for the first time in a long time, he had no control over the situation. The screen remained lit, displaying numbers that no longer represented security, but doubt. And at that moment, even before any rational explanation, he understood that this was not just a financial problem, it was the beginning of something bigger, something that would jeopardize not only his assets, but the very confidence that sustained everything he had built. The confident smile of the morning seemed to belong to someone else. Was this topic satisfactory? Would you like to make any adjustments, pace, tone, protagonist details, or can we move on to the next one? The investor's name appeared on dozens of documents scattered across his desk, though he rarely needed to see it in print. In the corridors of Chicago's financial sector, his surname served as an informal seal of credibility. He wasn't a celebrity, nor a media-savvy manager, but someone who had grown in a solid, predictable way, exactly how he liked his investments to behave. He hadn't started at the top. He came from a middle-class family in rural Illinois, where stability was synonymous with survival. His father had worked for decades in the same factory. His mother managed the household budget with almost mathematical rigor. It was there that he had learned, at a young age, that security didn't come from big bets, but from the systematic elimination of risks. This logic had accompanied him through university, his first internships at regional banks, until he reached higher positions in private funds. The environment in which he now operated reflected this trajectory. The company he consulted for didn't sell promises of quick riches, it sold predictability. Its clients were conservative business people, discreet heirs, families who preferred slow growth to appearing in rankings. And he fit perfectly into this ecosystem, someone who spoke little, delivered results, and avoided any move that could be interpreted as reckless. Among his colleagues, there was respect but little intimacy. Conversations rarely went beyond the realm of the market, quarterly reports or regulatory changes. He kept his distance by choice. He believed that excessive personal ties created emotional noise, and noise was the enemy of clarity. This stance had protected him for years until it began to isolate him without him realizing it. There was, however, one exception in this tight-knit circle, a former college classmate who now worked at another financial institution in New York. They exchanged sporadic messages, quick comments on trends, subtle warnings about unusual movements. Nothing that violated explicit rules, but enough to maintain an open line between two professionals who trusted each other more than they publicly admitted. It was to this contact that he thought to turn while analyzing the reports more closely. Something about the transactions didn't follow the typical pattern of blatant fraud. There were no abrupt transfers or isolated orders. What emerged before him was a sequence of distributed decisions, too small to trigger automatic alerts, but coordinated with enough precision to, over time, generate a devastating impact. The system showed that some positions had been adjusted at unusual times, early mornings, weekends, bank holidays. Technically, everything was still within valid permissions. No clearly unauthorized access, no inconsistent digital signatures. It was as if someone were operating with in-depth knowledge of the internal routines and limitations of the control mechanisms. Meanwhile, the surrounding city continued to exert its quiet influence. Chicago wasn't just a backdrop. It was part of how that world functioned. The local culture valued efficiency, resilience, and discretion. Mistakes weren't announced. They were quickly corrected or buried under new results. Admitting vulnerability, especially in the financial sector, was seen as strategic weakness. This context explained why he hadn't yet officially notified anyone. He hadn't called the brokerage firm, nor had he contacted the compliance department. Every step needed to be carefully considered. A premature warning could lead to internal investigations, account freezes, and loss of client trust. He knew that once the formal process began, he would lose narrative control of the situation. On the other side of the problem, the shadow of the antagonist began to emerge, not as a visible figure, but as an implicit presence, someone patient, meticulous, comfortable with anonymity, not an impulsive thief, but a strategist, someone who understood not only systems, but human behavior, who knew exactly how far he could go without being noticed. This antagonist didn't need to physically appear to influence decisions. Its influence was embedded in the data, in the choices made at specific moments, in the exploitation of loopholes that only someone very familiar with the American financial environment could identify. Complex regulations, multiple layers of auditing, excessive reliance on automation, all of this, paradoxically, created opportunities for those who knew where to look. As the investor cross-referenced the information, an unsettling feeling formed. This didn't seem like a classic external attack. There were signs of something closer, more integrated into the system. Perhaps someone with legitimate access, perhaps someone who knew, directly or indirectly, the same rules he had followed throughout his career. The tension didn't stem from an explicit threat, but from its absence. No ransom message, no warning, just the growing emptiness where once there had been reliable numbers. The world he knew, structured, logical, predictable, was beginning to reveal internal cracks. And for the first time, he found himself forced to consider a hypothesis he had always dismissed. Perhaps the real danger lay not in volatile markets or global crises, but in the false sense of control built up over years of quiet success. The system was working, the rules were being followed, and yet something was profoundly wrong. The decision to act came without drama. He closed the open reports, stood up from his chair, and left the office with firm steps, as if it were just another scheduled meeting. The elevator took him to the lower floor, where the company's information technology department was located, a less elegant, more functional space, occupied by multiple screens and professionals accustomed to dealing with invisible glitches. There, he made no accusations. He simply requested a thorough technical verification of his account access, presenting the data he had gathered. The request was received professionally, but also with some surprise. It was unusual for someone of his profile to raise suspicions without an obvious error. Nevertheless, the procedure was initiated. The initial responses arrived too quickly to be reassuring. There was no clear evidence of external intrusion, no logins from unusual locations, no explicit authentication breaches. On the contrary, all analyzed accesses corresponded to valid permissions executed with credentials recognized by the system. This finding shifted the problem to a more uncomfortable territory. If there was no intrusion, then there was legitimate use, or at the very least something the system considered legitimate. Security had not been breached, it had been circumvented. While the technical team deepened their analysis, he returned to the office and did something he rarely did: cancelled appointments. He claimed to be unwell. He closed the door. He needed time, but not to reflect, to cross-reference data. He began to manually reconstruct the timeline of the movements, associating each adjustment with market events, public announcements, and regulatory changes. That's when he noticed the hidden pattern. The most damaging transactions didn't occur during periods of high volatility, but on neutral days when analysts' attention was scattered. They were executed at times when monitoring teams were operating on a reduced schedule. It wasn't just technical knowledge, it was operational understanding. He contacted his former colleague in New York, sending only charts and schedules, without lengthy explanations. The reply came a few hours later, short and direct. It didn't seem random. It looked like someone testing limits, moving forward a little, retreating, observing reactions. This return broadened the scope of the conflict. It was no longer just about recovering values or identifying a specific flaw. Someone was evaluating the system in real time, adapting to the invisible responses that it was now beginning to provoke. Every check, every internal consultation could be perceived from the other side. The pressure increased when a long-standing client requested a detailed review of his portfolio, mentioning that he had noticed minor inconsistencies in the monthly reports. Nothing serious yet, but enough to raise a red flag. The investor calmly conducted the meeting, offering plausible technical explanations, but left with the certainty that the problem was beginning to spill over. At this point, the first indirect costs emerged. To avoid exposure, he needed to reallocate his own resources, temporarily cover discrepancies, and adjust projections. Decisions that wouldn't make headlines, but eroded his safety margin. The conflict ceased to be abstract and began to directly interfere with his professional position. The company, in turn, began asking more specific questions. The compliance department requested additional documentation. Nothing accusatory, but formal. The kind of formality that once initiated is difficult to reverse. He realized that time was beginning to work against him. Meanwhile, new transactions appeared in the account, smaller than before, almost insignificant in isolation, but enough to demonstrate something unsettling. Whoever was behind it was still operating. There was no retreat. There was no pause. It was a silent response to the ongoing investigation. He then understood that he was trapped in an asymmetrical game. He needed to follow rules, justify every step, protect reputations, including his own. The antagonist, invisible, had no such limitations. He could advance slowly, without haste, exploiting bureaucracy as an ally. The tension wasn't manifesting in direct confrontations, but in increasingly restricted choices. Every decision had potential consequences. Alerting authorities too early could destroy your career. Waiting too long could irreversibly amplify the damage. There was no manual for that situation. At the end of the day, as he left the building with the sky darkening over Chicago, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Genuine uncertainty. Not about the market, but about the system he had always believed he understood completely. The conflict was established. There was no going back to the previous state. Someone had entered their territory without asking permission, and now any movement could be observed, interpreted, and exploited. The game had truly begun. In the following days, the problem ceased to be merely technical or financial and began to infiltrate areas he had always kept under control. The first crack appeared at home. The nights became shorter, not due to classic insomnia, but due to constant interruptions. He would wake up before his alarm clock, check his cell phone, mentally review numbers while the rest of the city was still asleep. The once predictable domestic routine began to unravel. His relationship with his wife, built on stability and comfortable silence, felt the impact. There were no open discussions, but questions arose that were too simple to ignore. Why so many cancelled meetings? Why that excessive focus on reports that previously seemed routine? He answered with generalities, avoiding details. He knew that any partial explanation could generate greater concerns, and he wasn't ready to share the burden of uncertainty. At work, another subplot was developing in parallel. A younger, recently promoted analyst began reviewing processes that had remained untouched for years. Officially, it was part of an internal modernization initiative. In practice, it meant someone asking new questions about old systems. The investor watched from a distance, trying to assess whether this represented a risk or an opportunity. This analyst showed no hostility, only curiosity. But curiosity in that context was dangerous. Any discovery that went unchecked could accelerate formal investigations. Still, interfering directly would draw attention. He opted for an intermediate strategy, providing enough information to guide the focus without revealing the core of the problem. Meanwhile, the contact in New York brought a new element to the plot. The colleague mentioned having seen similar patterns at another institution months earlier. Nothing officially confirmed, but rumors of internal movements that were difficult to trace. It wasn't a mass attack, but something more selective, almost handcrafted. This information broadened the scope of the conflict. Perhaps he wasn't the only target. This possibility brought two immediate consequences. The first was an unsettling sense of replaceability. If there were other cases, then it wasn't special, just another point on an invisible map. The second was time pressure. If it was happening in more than one place, it was only a matter of time before someone publicly exposed the pattern. The antagonist, still faceless, seemed to anticipate these moves. The suspicious transactions began to space out, as if the pace were being adjusted to reduce visibility. Small amounts, operations almost irrelevant individually, but enough to maintain a presence. It was a way of saying that it was still there, watching. A critical subplot emerged when the legal department requested access to certain historical records, citing a preventative audit. The word preventative did not reassure him. On the contrary, it indicated that something had caught the attention of higher levels of the company. He understood that the room for maneuver was narrowing. In this scenario, he made a decision that contradicted his own philosophy. He began to act without complete certainty. He created a parallel monitoring account, adjusted internal limits, and implemented manual checks outside the standard protocol. Discrete measures, but ones that represented a departure from absolute trust in the automated system. These actions yielded ambiguous results. On the one hand, they allowed for the identification of micro-deviations almost in real time. On the other hand, they increased personal risk. If discovered, they could be interpreted as an attempt at concealment, even if the intention was protection. Every step now carried a moral ambiguity. The time pressure became explicit as a major quarterly report approached. The numbers needed to add up. There would be no room for quiet adjustments after publication. Either the problem would be solved, or it would become visible to external investors, regulators, and the specialized press. Amidst all of this, a final subplot began to take shape. The realization that the antagonist knew their reactions. The suspicious transactions seemed to cease whenever he implemented a new control, only to reappear days later, bypassing the newly created barrier. It wasn't coincidence, it was adaptation. This realization changed the nature of the conflict. It was no longer just about protecting assets, but about understanding the logic of the other side. Someone was studying not only the system, but the human behavior behind it, including their own. The subplots converged at an inevitable point. Personal life, professional reputation, financial security, and identity were now intertwined by a fragile thread. Any rupture would affect everything at once. Time was running out. The margin for error was shrinking. And even without ever having seen the antagonist's face, he felt his presence in every decision he had to make. The turning point didn't come in the form of further loss, but of discovery. It happened on an ordinary morning when he decided to review something he had previously considered irrelevant, the system's old permission records. Not the active authorizations, which had already been exhaustively analyzed, but those granted years ago and never formally revoked. These permissions belonged to employees who were no longer with the company, temporary consultants, and service providers who had briefly worked in the technology department. Most were automatically deactivated, as expected. Some, however, remained in a hybrid state, technically inactive, but still recognized by specific modules of the legacy system. It was there that the first clear break in the puzzle emerged. One of those permissions was linked to a name he knew. Someone who wasn't part of the current team, but who had been involved years before in the migration of the company's financial platforms. A respected expert, praised for his efficiency, who had left without apparent conflict. The revelation did not bring immediate relief. On the contrary, it shifted the problem to a more personal level. He vaguely remembered that professional, reserved, competent, someone who spoke little in meetings but deeply understood the systems he built. There had never been reason for distrust. Precisely for that reason, the discovery was disturbing. Before acting, he decided to test the hypothesis. He created a simulation environment, replicating the identified hybrid permissions. Within a few hours, he confirmed his fears. That type of access would allow subtle movements beyond the reach of the main alerts, as long as they were executed with surgical precision. It wasn't a glaring flaw, but a poorly resolved legacy from the past. While he was processing this information, something unexpected happened. A message arrived on a channel he rarely used, an old, almost abandoned address. The content was minimal. No threat, no explanation, just an indirect reference to a decision made years ago during a systems migration, accompanied by a comment that only someone involved in that project could make. There was no signature, there was no request, just the silent confirmation that he had been identified on the other side. This contact changed everything. Until then, the antagonist had been an abstraction, a set of actions, patterns, and data. Now, there was explicit intent, communication, a step beyond technical exploration, mutual recognition. The message didn't demand a response, but it created a choice. Ignoring it would mean continuing the game under the same asymmetrical conditions. Responding could escalate the conflict, but it could also open up space for understanding or a fatal mistake. He chose not to respond immediately. Instead, he selectively activated the legal department, presenting the discovery as a historical vulnerability, not as an active attack. It was a delicate maneuver, designed to protect his position while buying time. The antagonist, however, seemed to anticipate this move. In the following hours, a series of complex operations were executed, not to withdraw assets, but to reorganize positions in order to mask old traces. It was a cleanup. A closing of a cycle. It was at that moment that the investor realized the true magnitude of what was at stake. It wasn't just about financial gains. This was a prolonged experiment, a living proof of concept built over years. He had been chosen not for its fragility, but for its predictability. His confidence in the system had been the main driver of his access. The final revelation came when he cross-referenced the dates. The start of the actions coincided with a specific period in his career, a time when he himself had approved operational exceptions in the name of efficiency. Small, rational decisions made under deadline pressure. Nothing that, in isolation, seemed wrong. The antagonist had not invaded the system. He had been invited to stay. This understanding redefined the conflict. There was no simple external villain. There was a chain of decisions, technical and human choices, that now converged at that moment. The investor was not just a victim. He was part of the origin of the problem. The turning point was complete. The question was no longer just how to stop the antagonist, but how to assume or avoid responsibility for what was about to come to light. The game had changed direction, and there was no longer any way to pretend it was just a system error. The consequences began to manifest themselves even before any formal decision was made. The simple realization that the problem was rooted in past choices immediately altered how he perceived himself, not by others, yet, but by himself. The security that had always guided his actions now coexisted with the unsettling certainty that efficiency and risk had walked hand in hand for longer than he had admitted. In the corporate environment, the effects were subtle, yet progressive. The legal department began requesting more frequent meetings, always with broad agendas and carefully neutral language. No explicit accusations, but a growing interest in historical processes, operational exceptions, and archived decisions. Each request required precise, documented answers that left no room for future interpretations. He responded with discipline. He prepared detailed reports, contextualizing past decisions within the norms in force at the time. He avoided emotional justifications. He limited himself to facts, timelines, and measurable impacts. Even so, he realized that the focus had shifted. The goal was no longer just to understand what was happening now, but to reconstruct the logic that had allowed it to happen. The technical team, in turn, reacted with a mixture of respect and caution. The identified vulnerability required profound corrections, which involved rewriting parts of the legacy system. This demanded time, resources, and above all, authorization at higher levels of the hierarchy. The investor began to participate in discussions that were not previously part of their routine, involving deadlines, regulatory risks, and reputational impacts. On a personal level, the reactions were more direct. His wife noticed the change in the tone of their conversations, the rigidity of their schedules, and the way he now separated work and quiet time. On one particular night, she didn't press him. She simply commented that he seemed to be carrying something he wasn't used to sharing. That simple observation carried more weight than any accusation. This emotional pressure didn't result in a breakdown, but in adjustment. He came to accept that he didn't control all the variables, a rare but necessary admission. This recognition influenced his subsequent decisions. Instead of trying to solve everything alone, he began to strategically distribute responsibilities, involving key people without revealing the complete picture. Meanwhile, the antagonist reacted in his own way. The suspicious movement ceased almost completely. The silence, this time, was different. It didn't suggest abandonment, but a planned retreat, as if someone had achieved exactly what they intended and was now observing the unfolding events from a distance. This lack of activity created a paradox. Without new losses, the external urgency decreased, but internally, the tension increased. The inaction could mean that evidence had been erased, trails closed, and responsibilities diluted. Time, which had previously pressed for quick answers, now threatened to transform the case into something too diffuse to be held accountable. The company began preparing for various scenarios. One involved proactive communication with regulators, should the vulnerability be classified as material. Another considered the possibility of resolving everything internally, patching systems and absorbing losses discreetly. Each scenario had different costs, financial, legal, and human. He participated in these discussions with calculated attention. He knew that any more emphatic stance could be interpreted as self-defense. He opted for a technical approach, focused on mitigating future risks. This choice preserved his professional image, but did not eliminate the feeling that something essential was being swept under the rug. The most unexpected reaction came from a colleague in New York. In a brief conversation, he mentioned that the similar case he had cited months earlier had been quietly closed, without public repercussions. No visible punishment, no deep structural correction. Just minor adjustments and institutional silence. The implicit message was clear. The system tended to protect itself. This information placed the investor before a silent dilemma. Going with the flow meant preserving his career and stability. Questioning the model would imply significant personal risks, with no guarantee of real change. There was no clear right or wrong, only different consequences. Reactions to the tipping point didn't produce immediate explosions, but they redefined trajectories. Relationships became more formal. Decisions began to carry additional layers of caution. The world around them continued to function, but now with a level of awareness that didn't exist before. He understood that this phase was not one of resolution, but of accommodation. The pieces were repositioning themselves. And although the initial impact had been contained, the waves generated by the turning point would continue to propagate silently, shaping everything that would come next. The change didn't happen abruptly. There was no dramatic decision or visible rupture. The growth began in small gestures, almost imperceptible to an outside observer, but profoundly significant for someone accustomed to operating within narrow margins of control. He began by reviewing processes he had previously accepted as immutable, not just correcting technical flaws, but questioning assumptions. Why were certain authorizations never reviewed? Why did efficiency always prevail over redundancy? These questions didn't arise in formal meetings, but in practical actions, convening smaller groups, cross-reviewing decisions, implementing additional validation steps. This stance required something he had avoided throughout his career: exposure. By involving more people, he relinquished absolute control and accepted the risk of disagreement. Initially, this caused discomfort. Some suggestions directly contradicted methods he himself had established years before. Instead of discarding these contributions, he began to test them. On a personal level, growth took on a different form. He began sharing information more honestly with his wife, without going into technical details, but acknowledging the existence of real uncertainties. This change altered the dynamic between them. Defensive silence gave way to shorter but more direct conversations. It wasn't complete relief, but it created a space where the problem didn't have to be carried alone. At work, the transformation was evident in how he dealt with mistakes. Before, he treated them as deviations to be quickly corrected without much publicity. Now, he began to document them, discuss causes, and record lessons learned. This approach wasn't popular with everyone, but it created a different culture, less focused on the appearance of perfection, more oriented towards resilience. Even in his absence, the antagonist continued to influence his decisions. The possibility of someone observing invisible loopholes made him more attentive to human behavior within the system. He began to evaluate not only technical skills, but also behavioral patterns: who avoided review, who hoarded information, who always operated outside of standard hours. This surveillance did not turn into paranoia. On the contrary, it became a method. It created rotations of responsibility, time limits for permissions, and automatic reviews with mandatory human intervention. Each measure represented a break with the previous model, based on implicit trust and maximum efficiency. Growth also required accepting losses. Some decisions resulted in additional costs, operational delays, and internal questioning. Instead of quickly reversing them to restore indicators, he stayed the course. For the first time, he prioritized sustainability over immediate performance. This stance caught the attention of leadership, not explicitly, but through invitations to broader strategic discussions. He realized his role was changing. From a reliable executor, he was becoming seen as someone capable of anticipating systemic risks. This change was not without risks, but it amplified its impact. Internally, the greatest achievement was abandoning the illusion of neutrality. He had always believed that well-designed systems eliminated the need for moral judgments. Now he understood that every technical decision carried implicit values. Choosing efficiency over redundancy was a choice. Delegating without reviewing was a choice. And choices had consequences. This understanding didn't make him more hesitant, but more aware. His decisions began to consider not only what worked, but for whom and at what cost. This subtle shift redefined his relationship with his own work. At the end of that period, the main conflict was still unresolved. The antagonist had not been publicly identified. The losses had not been fully recovered. But something essential had changed. He no longer reacted to events by trying to restore an idealized past. Instead, he was building a more robust model for the future. The challenge wasn't about defeating an invisible enemy, but about transforming how one operated within an imperfect system. And this silent, progressive growth prepared the ground for what was yet to come. a final confrontation that would demand not only strategy, but coherence between values and actions. Preparation began when the final systemic correction reports were ready. These were not documents intended for wide circulation, but for strategic decisions. Risk maps, impact simulations, regulatory exposure scenarios. Each page represented a choice that could no longer be postponed. He actively participated in consolidating this information, but avoided taking on an excessive leading role. He knew that at that stage, excessive visibility could be interpreted as an attempt to control the narrative. Even so, it was evident that his experience guided the most relevant conclusions. The subplots began to unravel one by one. The young analyst was reassigned to another project after delivering a detailed report on legacy systems. The legal department established a clear course of action, prioritizing immediate technical fixes and restricted communication unless new external evidence emerged. At home, conversations became more objective, less laden with diffuse tension. This apparent closure, however, brought no relief. On the contrary, it created a feeling of suspension, as if everything was too organized before an inevitable impact. He recognized this pattern, the same one that preceded major market corrections: silence, alignment, restrained expectation. It was in this context that new information emerged. An internal audit, conducted by an independent team, identified a set of old transactions that had been automatically reclassified months ago. At the time, the reclassification seemed like a minor technical adjustment. Now, in light of the recent findings, it took on a different significance. These operations did not represent direct losses, but they altered how certain historical decisions would be interpreted by regulators. In simple terms, what previously seemed like an operational exception could be reinterpreted as a governance failure. The difference was subtle, but enough to shift responsibilities. He realized that the climax would not be a direct confrontation with the invisible antagonist, but an institutional decision. Someone would have to publicly acknowledge the origin of the problem, even if the system as a whole had benefited from those choices for years. The preparation then took on a personal character. He revisited timelines, old emails, archived approvals. Not to defend himself, but to understand exactly where his signature appeared, where he had agreed without questioning, where he had trusted too much. At the same time, external signs began to align. A regulatory body announced a broader review of control practices in similar financial institutions. The specialized press published a generic article about silent vulnerabilities in legacy systems. It didn't mention names, but the climate was changing. He understood that the time for choice was approaching. Waiting meant risking being swept away by external events. Acting implied exposing weaknesses that the system preferred to keep invisible. Neither option was comfortable. Tensions rose when he received an invitation to a restricted meeting with senior leadership. The agenda was far too broad to be casual. Governance, accountability, communication, words that, in that context, carried specific weight. The night before the meeting, he didn't work late. For the first time in weeks, he turned off his computer earlier than usual. He needed to arrive clear-headed, not exhausted. The final preparation wasn't technical, but ethical. The climax was not shaping up as an explosion, but as a convergence. All paths, past decisions, recent corrections, institutional silences, led to that point. The antagonist, invisible since the last communication, no longer needed to act. The system was about to confront itself. When he entered the meeting room the following morning, he knew that this conversation would define not only the outcome of the case, but the narrative that would remain afterward. The space for neutrality had run out. The preparation was complete. The next step would require more than competence. It would require consciously accepting the consequences of choices made long before any screen displayed incorrect numbers. The meeting room had no windows. It was a space designed for sensitive decisions, where time seemed suspended. At the table sat members of senior leadership, legal representatives, and 2 governance executives. No face expressed urgency, but all carried the same restrained expectation. Something needed to be decided there. The presentation began objectively. Graphs, timelines, corrections already implemented. The institutional discourse followed a clear line. The problem had been identified, contained, and technically resolved. It remained to decide the level of exposure and the official narrative. Up to that point, nothing demanded a break from the norm. Then came the direct question. At what point did this vulnerability originate? The silence that followed was not awkward but heavy. Everyone knew that the answer did not lie in the last few months, nor in the invisible attack that had mobilized recent resources. It lay much earlier, in decisions that had been considered exemplary at the time. When he began to speak, he didn't improvise. He presented dates, contexts, and real operational pressures. He explained why exceptions had been granted, why older systems remained active longer than planned. Nothing sounded like a personal defense. It was a precise, technical account. The turning point came when he went beyond expectations. Without being asked, he explicitly admitted his role in the key decisions that allowed the vulnerability to exist, not as a dramatic confession, but as a logical observation. He acknowledged that the positive results achieved over the years had also been sustained by those choices. This movement shifted the focus of the meeting. The emphasis shifted from mere mitigation to responsibility. The previously controlled environment became unstable, not because anyone was indignant, but because the most convenient path, distributing blame within the system, had just been interrupted. The lawyers reacted with immediate caution. They warned of legal implications, dangerous precedents, risks of unnecessary exposure. It was the expected discourse. Still, something had changed. The clarity brought by that admission had created a new variable: coherence. It was at this moment that the last unexpected piece of information emerged. One of the governance executives revealed that during the audit, an old internal report, archived and never escalated, had been identified that mentioned exactly that vulnerability years earlier. The report had been classified as low risk and closed without action. The unseen antagonist, after all, had not been the first to notice the flaw. The room understood almost simultaneously that the problem wasn't an isolated individual nor a skilled external expert. It was an institutional pattern: efficiency rewarded, warnings minimized, responsibility diluted. The investor wasn't the only link, just the first to break the silence. The final decision did not come in the form of exemplary punishment. It came as a strategic rupture. The company chose to proactively inform regulators, presenting the vulnerability as a historical systemic flaw, accompanied by structural corrections and a complete governance review. No names would be publicly exposed at that time, but there would also be no concealment. The cost would be high: financial, reputational, internal, but controlled. When the meeting ended, he left the room without applause or disapproval. He was simply aware that the outcome hadn't been the most comfortable, but it had been the most consistent. Hours later, alone in his office, he reopened the investment platform. The balance still didn't reflect all the corrections. Some losses would be permanent. But for the first time since the beginning, the numbers made sense. Not because they were high, but because they were real. The antagonist never reappeared. There was no arrest, no dramatic revelation, because in the end, he wasn't the center of the story. The climax wasn't the defeat of someone invisible, but the collapse of a convenient narrative, and the definitive transformation of someone who, upon seeing the screen for the first time, believed they were merely checking their balance. The official announcement came weeks later, in a carefully planned format. There were no scandalous headlines or abrupt market crashes. The announcement was technical, almost discreet, presented as part of a broader governance review. To the outside public, it was just another adjustment in a sector accustomed to silent changes. For those on the inside, however, nothing was the same. The company underwent a profound restructuring. Processes previously considered untouchable were redesigned. Old systems, maintained for convenience, were finally deactivated. The word efficiency lost its absolute status and began to share space with less popular terms, such as redundancy, traceability, and shared responsibility. He remained at the institution, but in a different role. He ceased to be merely the trusted investor, the predictable trader. He became an internal benchmark for assessing structural risks, not because he had all the answers, but because he had learned to ask the right questions, including the uncomfortable ones. His career didn't progress in the traditional way. There was no immediate promotion or public recognition. But there was no fall either. What emerged was something rarer in that environment: silent respect. Colleagues began consulting him before critical decisions, not out of formal authority, but out of trust built from difficult choices. On a personal level, the change was more subtle, yet more lasting. The house returned to a routine, but not the same as before. Conversations with his wife gained a different quality, less based on absolute certainties, more open to shared doubts. He didn't become someone expansive or emotional, but he stopped treating vulnerability as a flaw. The financial losses were not fully recovered. Part of the impact remained recorded in the numbers as a permanent reminder. Curiously, this no longer bothered him. Money had ceased to be the main indicator of control. Now, it was just one consequence among many. The antagonist was never officially identified. No name surfaced in final reports. No external accountability occurred. For some, this meant impunity. For him, it meant something more complex: the understanding that systems fail less because of individual actions and more because of silent consensus. Over time, the episode began to be cited internally as a learning experience, a neutral, almost harmless expression. He accepted the term, even knowing that the real learning had been personal before it became institutional. One morning, months later, he repeated the gesture that had started it all. He sat at the table, opened the platform, and accessed his account. No special expectations, no anticipated smile, just full attention. The balance appeared on the screen, lower than it had ever been, stable, consistent. He didn't react immediately. He observed the numbers as one observes a familiar scenario in a new light. There was no surprise, nor exaggerated relief, just a clear sense of closure. Not because everything had been resolved, but because he now understood exactly what those numbers represented, and more importantly, what they no longer represented. Blind trust had been replaced by something less comfortable, but more solid: conscience. And this, he knew, would change all the decisions that were yet to come. Years later, the case was rarely mentioned outside very specific circles. New systems, new regulations, new crises had occupied the space of collective memory. Still, some decisions made at that time continued to silently influence the sector. He no longer followed every market movement with the same obsession. He was more selective about where to focus his attention and trust. Sometimes when he heard someone say, "Just check the balance," he would smile slightly, not out of irony, but out of recognition. Some screens display numbers, others reveal limits. It is not always possible to distinguish the two at first glance. This story isn't just about numbers, systems, or investments. It's about silent decisions, overconfidence, and the consequences that accumulate far from the spotlight. How many times have you fully trusted something simply because it always worked? If this story has sparked reflection, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who lives surrounded by seemingly solid certainties. Leave your interpretation in the comments. Was the real risk in the system, in the people, or in a combination of both? Stories like this continue to happen, not because they are extraordinary, but because they are human. The next screen you look at may be telling you more than you think.